I want to tell you something I've noticed in every single human being I've ever worked with, and I mean every single one. The people we love most terrify us the most. There's this strange, almost unbearable paradox woven into your heart. You long for someone to truly see you, to know you completely, to hold you without conditions. And the moment someone gets close enough to do exactly that, something inside you begins to panic. You start building walls, not because you're broken, not because you don't care, but because getting close to another person means stepping into the most dangerous territory your soul knows. You see, I've spent my entire life exploring the hidden chambers of the human psyche, and what I've discovered is this. Your walls aren't keeping love out. They're keeping something else in. Something you're terrified the other person will see. Something you can barely look at yourself. And until you understand what that something is, you'll keep repeating the same painful pattern. You'll let someone in just far enough, and then slam the door. You'll push away the very intimacy you're desperately craving. And you'll wonder why you feel so alone even when you're with someone who genuinely loves you. But here's what I need you to understand right now, before we go any further. This isn't a character flaw. This is your psyche trying to protect you from an old wound you haven't fully faced yet. And once you understand the real reason you build these walls, once you see what's actually happening beneath the surface, everything changes. You can finally stop running. You can finally let someone in. Not perfectly, not without fear, but consciously. With awareness. With choice. So stay with me, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just theory. This is the map to your own heart, drawn from decades of sitting with people exactly like you. People who thought they were too damaged for real intimacy. Who discovered they were actually just protecting something sacred they didn't know how to share yet. Now, let me be completely honest with you about what real closeness actually demands from you. Because I don't think anyone talks about this truthfully enough. When you allow someone to get truly close to you, you're not just sharing your time or your space or even your body. You're doing something far more vulnerable than that. You're allowing another human being to become a mirror. And mirrors show you everything. The beautiful parts, yes, but also the parts you've spent your whole life trying to hide, trying to deny, trying to pretend don't exist. Every intimate relationship forces you to confront aspects of yourself you've buried deep in what I call the shadow. These are the parts of you that you've deemed unacceptable, shameful, too much, not enough. Maybe you learned as a child that your anger was dangerous, so you buried it so deep you can't even feel it anymore. Maybe you learned that your needs were burdensome, so you became the person who never asks for anything. Maybe you discovered that being vulnerable got you hurt, so you learned to perform strength even when you were crumbling inside. And here's the absolutely crucial thing you need to understand. Those buried parts don't disappear. They don't dissolve. They live in your unconscious, running programs you can't even see, making decisions you think are yours but are actually just old survival strategies playing out automatically. So when someone gets close enough to love you, really love you, they inevitably bump up against these shadow parts. They see your anger leak out in passive-aggressive comments. They notice how you never really ask for what you need. They feel the wall you put up the moment you start to feel too much. And suddenly you're faced with a terrifying choice. Do you let them see what you've been hiding? Do you risk showing them the parts of yourself you've labeled as unlovable? Or do you pull back, create distance, find reasons why this relationship isn't quite right, protect yourself from the exposure that true intimacy demands? Most people choose the walls. Not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically, like a reflex. Because the alternative feels like death. It feels like you'll be rejected, abandoned, confirmed in your deepest fear that you are, in fact, too much or not enough or fundamentally unlovable. I've seen this pattern destroy beautiful relationships between people who genuinely loved each other. Not because the love wasn't real, but because neither person understood what was actually happening. They mistook their psychological defense mechanisms for truth. They thought the discomfort meant something was wrong with the relationship, when actually it meant something was finally right enough to trigger their deepest healing. Think about the last time you pulled away from someone who was getting too close. What was actually happening in that moment? If you're truly honest with yourself, beneath the surface reasons you gave yourself for them, there was probably a feeling. Maybe it felt like claustrophobia, like you couldn't breathe. Maybe it felt like panic, like things were moving too fast. Maybe it felt like a sudden conviction that this person wasn't really right for you after all. But what was underneath that feeling? I'll tell you what I've found in almost every case. Underneath was fear. Not fear of the other person, but fear of what their love would reveal about you. Fear of being fully seen and found lacking. Fear of needing someone and being disappointed. Fear of opening your heart completely and having it broken. Fear of losing yourself in another person. Fear of repeating old wounds. Fear of being trapped. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being too much. These fears aren't rational, and they don't respond to rational arguments. They're ancient, pre-verbal, wired into your nervous system from experiences you may not even consciously remember. And they're absolutely running your relationships, whether you realize it or not. Your walls are these fears made solid. They're your psyche's attempt to prevent the catastrophe it believes is inevitable if you truly open up. And the cruel irony is that by building these walls to protect yourself from pain, you guarantee the very isolation and loneliness that hurts most of all. You create the abandonment you're trying to avoid, because people eventually stop trying to reach someone who keeps pushing them away. You prove your fear right, not because you're unlovable, but because you never gave anyone the chance to love the real you. The mechanisms we develop to protect ourselves become our prisons. I have observed this pattern countless times in my work. How patients construct elaborate systems of defense that they mistake for strength. They rationalize their emotional distance as independence. They reframe their inability to trust as wisdom gained from experience. They wear their cynicism like armor, calling it maturity. But wisdom and fear are not the same thing. True independence means you can stand alone when necessary, not that you're incapable of standing together with others. Real maturity involves discernment about whom to trust, not a blanket refusal to trust anyone at all. What you're really doing is letting past wounds dictate your present reality. You're living as if every new person in your life is guilty of crimes they haven't committed, as if every relationship is destined to repeat the same painful patterns. This is what I call being possessed by the past. You're no longer responding to what is actually happening now, but to ghosts of old hurts. Consider how exhausting this way of living becomes. You must constantly monitor yourself, police your emotions, suppress your natural longings for connection. You catch yourself feeling something genuine for someone and immediately shut it down. You start to relax into intimacy and reflexively pull back. You're always on guard, always braced for impact, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. This hypervigilance isn't protecting you, it's depleting you. You're spending enormous psychological energy maintaining these defenses, energy that could be directed toward actually building something meaningful. You've turned your inner world into a military installation, but there's no war happening except the one you're waging against your own nature. And here's what makes this tragedy even deeper. The people you're pushing away aren't always trying to hurt you. Some of them genuinely care. Some of them see your potential, your beauty, the parts of you that you've hidden away. But you can't let them close enough to actually offer you what you've been starving for, because accepting their care would mean lowering your defenses, and that feels like surrender. So instead, you perform a kind of psychological sleight of hand. You accept the surface-level interaction while denying the depth. You let someone take you to dinner, but you never reveal what truly troubles you. You allow the conversation, but you edit yourself in real time, monitoring every word for signs of weakness. You show them a version of you that's acceptable, manageable, that won't burden or overwhelm them. And then you go home alone and feel the absence even more acutely than before. Because here's what I learned through decades of listening to the human psyche. The loneliness isn't actually about being alone. It's about being unseen. You can be surrounded by people and feel utterly invisible. You can have a dozen friends and still feel like no one knows who you really are. The wound isn't solitude, it's disconnection from authentic recognition. When you were wounded as a child, when your needs were dismissed or your emotions were too much for the adults around you, you learned something devastating: that the real you is unacceptable. That lesson burrows deep into your psyche and builds its nest there. It becomes the lens through which you interpret every relationship, every interaction, every moment of potential intimacy. Someone reaches out with genuine affection, and you immediately think, they don't really know me. If they knew the real me, they wouldn't be here. Someone offers support, and you think, they're just being nice. They don't really want to deal with my problems. Someone expresses care, and you think, this won't last. Better not get attached. You see how the wound perpetuates itself? The very thing you long for becomes the thing you cannot accept, because accepting it would contradict the core belief that you're fundamentally unworthy of it. So you remain trapped in this terrible paradox, desperately wanting connection while unconsciously sabotaging every genuine attempt at it. And the people who try to love you? They eventually grow weary. Not because they don't care, but because loving someone who won't let themselves be loved is exhausting. They offer and offer, and you deflect and deflect, until finally they stop offering. And when they do, it confirms exactly what you always believed. That you were right not to trust, right not to open up, right to keep everyone at arm's length. The prophecy fulfills itself. The wound wins again. But here's what you must understand, and this is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you. This pattern isn't permanent. It feels permanent because you've lived with it for so long that it seems like your nature rather than your conditioning. Your psyche is remarkably plastic, even in adulthood. The neural pathways that fired together wired together, yes, but they can also be unwired and rewired. I've watched people in their 60s fundamentally reorganize their relationship to themselves after decades of self-abandonment. The brain you have today is not the brain you must have tomorrow. But transformation requires something most people aren't willing to give: sustained, uncomfortable attention. You cannot think your way out of these patterns. You cannot read enough books or listen to enough podcasts to intellectually bypass the actual work. The wound lives in your body, in your nervous system, in the automatic responses that happen before conscious thought arrives. To heal it, you must be willing to feel it. This is where most people turn back. They want the insight without the embodiment. They want to understand their patterns without actually interrupting them in real time. But understanding is just the beginning. It's like looking at a map of a country you've never visited, helpful, certainly, but not the same as walking its soil. When you begin to actually intervene in these moments, your system will rebel. You'll feel anxiety, guilt, the physical sensation of wrongness. This is your conditioning fighting for its survival. The wounded part of you has organized your entire life around avoiding abandonment, and now you're asking it to trust something new. Of course it resists. I remember working with someone who, for the first time in her adult life, told her mother she couldn't visit that weekend because she needed rest. A simple boundary, you might think. But she spent the next 3 days in a state of near panic, convinced she had damaged the relationship irreparably, checking her phone obsessively for messages. Her body was screaming that she had done something dangerous, even as her mind knew the boundary was reasonable. This is the gap you must learn to tolerate. The gap between what your nervous system believes is true and what is actually true. The nervous system doesn't understand concepts. It doesn't care about your therapy insights or self-help books. It speaks only in sensations: tightness in the chest, butterflies in the stomach, the urge to flee or freeze or fix. And it has been trained, often for decades, to interpret connection as threat. This is why intellectual understanding alone never heals attachment wounds. You can know, rationally, that you deserve better. You can articulate, with perfect clarity, why your childhood patterns are maladaptive. You can even explain to friends, with impressive psychological vocabulary, exactly what you're working through. But when that text doesn't come, when that person pulls back even slightly, your body doesn't consult your knowledge. It consults its database of survival strategies, and in that database, abandonment equals death. I have watched people sabotage beautiful relationships not because they didn't want them, but because their nervous system categorized safety as unfamiliar and therefore suspicious. The partner who was consistent felt boring. The one who showed up reliably seemed too available, and therefore not valuable. Their system had been calibrated to chaos, to the dopamine rush of uncertainty, to the relief of finally earning someone's intermittent attention. Stability registered not as peace but as the eerie quiet before disaster. One man I counseled had a particularly illuminating moment of awareness. He realized he only felt in love when he was anxious. The flutter in his stomach, which he had romanticized as passion, was actually his nervous system in threat response. He had confused activation with attraction. When he dated someone who treated him well, who was predictable and present, he felt nothing, or rather, he felt calm, and his psyche had no framework for recognizing calm as desirable. He kept returning to relationships that hurt him because pain felt like home. This is the cruelest trick of attachment trauma. It doesn't just teach you to accept poor treatment. It teaches you to crave it, to feel dead without it. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. You'll believe this is just who you are. You'll say, I'm just someone who needs a lot of reassurance, or, I'm naturally anxious in relationships. You'll pathologize your own nervous system's desperate attempt to survive an impossible situation. But let me tell you something. Your anxiety in relationship isn't a personality flaw. It's a smoke alarm going off in a burning building. The problem isn't that the alarm is too sensitive. The problem is the building is on fire. I've watched people spend years in therapy trying to become less needy, trying to learn to self-soothe, trying to develop secure attachment, while staying with someone who is fundamentally unavailable. It's like trying to learn to breathe underwater. The issue isn't your technique. The issue is you're in the wrong environment. And the person who put you there? They benefit enormously from your self-blame. Every hour you spend wondering what's wrong with you is an hour you're not asking what's wrong with them. Every therapy session focused on your anxiety is one that doesn't examine their behavior. They've successfully outsourced the problem of their emotional unavailability onto your nervous system. This is why they'll often encourage your therapy, your self-help books, your healing journey. Yes, you should work on your anxiety, they'll say supportively, never once acknowledging that they are the primary source of that anxiety. It's brilliant, really. Diabolical, but brilliant. The relationship becomes a closed loop of suffering. You feel anxious because they're inconsistent. Your anxiety makes you reach out more. Your reaching out triggers their withdrawal. Their withdrawal increases your anxiety. Round and round it goes, and somehow you're the one who ends up in therapy for it. And here's the part that will make you angry when you finally see it. You were never broken. Your attachment system was working exactly as it should. You were reading the situation accurately. The danger was real. The inconsistency was real. The emotional abandonment was real. Your body knew before your mind would admit it. This person cannot be trusted. This person will not consistently show up for you. And so you learned to become hyper-independent, not as a choice, but as a survival adaptation. You stopped asking for help because asking felt more dangerous than struggling alone. You stopped sharing your needs because every time you did, they were either minimized, forgotten, or used against you later. This wasn't you being strong. This was you learning that vulnerability leads to pain. The avoidant attachment pattern doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins in these small, repeated moments of emotional unavailability. It begins when a child reaches out and finds no one there. When they cry and learn that crying changes nothing. When they share excitement and are met with distraction or dismissal. You internalized a devastating belief. My emotions are too much. My needs are burdensome. I must handle everything myself. And this belief became the architecture of all your future relationships. As you grew, you found yourself attracted to people who felt familiar, which is to say, people who were also emotionally unavailable. Not because you consciously wanted to repeat the pattern, but because emotional distance felt like home. Intimacy felt foreign, almost threatening. When someone offered you consistent love, steady presence, genuine availability, you felt suffocated. You felt trapped, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because their closeness triggered every ancient wound that taught you closeness equals danger. So you withdrew. You created distance. You found reasons why the relationship wouldn't work. You sabotaged connection before it could fully form, because somewhere deep in your nervous system, you believed that staying meant inevitable abandonment, and leaving first meant control. This is the cruel paradox of avoidant attachment. You desperately want connection, but connection feels like a threat to your survival. You want to be seen, but being seen means revealing the parts of yourself you've learned to hide. You want to be loved, but receiving love requires trusting that it won't be withdrawn the moment you need it most. And trust is the one thing your childhood never taught you. So you constructed walls. Beautiful, sophisticated walls made of intellectualization, independence, and self-sufficiency. Walls that looked like strength but were actually protection. Walls that kept others out, yes, but also kept you locked inside, alone with wounds that never fully healed because they were never witnessed by another. And you may have told yourself for years that this was simply your personality. That you were just independent, or naturally private, or didn't need much from others. But beneath these comfortable narratives, there was often something else. A quiet exhaustion from holding it all together alone. A loneliness that didn't announce itself with tears, but rather with a persistent numbness, a sense of going through the motions while some essential part of you remained locked away, unreachable. The wounded child within you learned that reaching out meant disappointment. That asking for help meant being let down. That showing your underbelly meant being struck where you were most tender. And so you stopped reaching. You stopped asking. You stopped showing. But here is what few understand about this particular wound. It doesn't heal through more independence. It doesn't resolve by becoming even stronger. even more self-sufficient, even more capable of handling everything alone. That path, while tempting, only deepens the original injury. It's like trying to heal a broken bone by refusing to ever use it. The fracture may set incorrectly, creating a permanent limitation disguised as protection. No, this wound heals through something far more terrifying. Through allowing yourself to be incompetent in the presence of someone who will not punish you for it. Through deliberately choosing interdependence when every instinct screams for you to remain isolated. Through the radical, uncomfortable act of letting someone see you struggle without immediately proving you can handle it yourself. This is not about becoming dependent or helpless. It's about discovering that true strength includes the capacity to be vulnerable. That real maturity means knowing when to ask for support, not just how to stand alone. That authentic connection requires showing up as you actually are, uncertain, imperfect, sometimes overwhelmed, not as the polished version you've learned to present. I have watched clients spend years in this work, slowly learning to lower their guard. Learning to say, "I'm struggling," before they've already solved the problem. Learning to accept offers of help without immediately reciprocating to clear the debt. Learning to trust that relationship doesn't automatically mean abandonment, that vulnerability doesn't inevitably lead to violation. The transformation isn't comfortable. It never is. There's a period, sometimes brief, sometimes agonizingly prolonged, where you exist between two worlds. The old defensive patterns no longer serve you, but the new vulnerabilities haven't yet become natural. You feel exposed, clumsy, perpetually uncertain about whether you're doing this whole connection thing correctly. I've watched people in this transitional phase question everything. Am I being too needy? Not needy enough? Is this what normal friendship looks like, or am I just trauma bonding in a different costume? The hypervigilance that once protected them now scrutinizes their every social move with exhausting intensity. This is where many people retreat. The discomfort of the unknown becomes too much, and they return to their familiar isolation, telling themselves it wasn't worth it anyway. Better the devil you know than the vulnerability you don't. But here's what I've learned from those who push through. That awkward middle phase is precisely where the real work happens. It's where you discover that making mistakes in connection doesn't destroy relationships the way your childhood taught you it would. Where you learn that people can be disappointed in you without abandoning you. That conflict doesn't automatically equal catastrophe. You stumble through conversations where you share too much or too little. You misjudge social cues and feel the familiar flush of shame. But then something unexpected happens. The other person extends grace. They clarify without condemning. They adjust without rejecting. And slowly, painfully, you begin to internalize a new truth. Imperfection is not incompatible with belonging. The child who raised themselves believed they had to be flawless to be worthy of care. The adult learning connection discovers they were worthy all along, flaws and fumbles included. This realization doesn't arrive in a single moment of enlightenment. It accumulates through 100 small experiences. A friend who doesn't flee when you have a bad day. A partner who stays present through your anxiety rather than punishing you for it. A community that makes space for your whole, complicated humanity rather than just the competent parts you learned to display. These relationships don't just feel better, they heal at a structural level. They rewire the original wound not through discussion or insight, but through repeated experience. Your nervous system, which learned that dependency equals danger, begins to learn something new. That connection can be safe. That needing someone doesn't automatically mean being abandoned. This is why trauma-informed relationships are so powerful. They don't demand perfection. They make room for repair. You snap at your partner because you're overwhelmed. In a conditional dynamic, this would trigger withdrawal or retaliation. But in a secure one? They see past the behavior to the state beneath it. They say, "You seem really stressed. What do you need?" And suddenly, your nervous system receives information it never got as a child. That making a mistake doesn't end connection. This is reparative attachment, not the absence of rupture, but the presence of repair. It teaches your body what your mind already knows, that relationships can bend without breaking. And over time, something extraordinary happens. You begin to internalize this security. The soothing voice of that friend, that therapist, that partner, it becomes your own inner voice. The part of you that could only criticize begins to also comfort. The part that could only push begins to also reach. You start to trust, not blindly, but wisely. You begin to recognize green flags as clearly as you once spotted red ones. You notice the people who show up consistently, who apologize when they hurt you, who don't need you to be small to feel big themselves. And most radically of all, you begin to believe you deserve this. Not because you've finally become perfect, but because you've realized perfection was never the requirement. You were always worthy of love. You just needed a world that could show you how to receive it. Perhaps you're wondering how this looks in practice. How does a person actually live after this realization settles into their bones? Let me tell you what I've observed, what the patterns reveal when someone truly integrates this understanding. You stop performing. That's the first thing. The exhausting theater of trying to be what you think others want, it simply falls away. Not through effort, but through the quiet recognition that the performance was costing you more than any approval could ever be worth. You begin speaking in your actual voice, the one that's been waiting beneath all those carefully edited words. Sometimes it trembles, sometimes it's uncertain, but it's yours, and that authenticity resonates in ways your polished performance never could. Your relationships transform, often dramatically. Some people drift away, and you let them. Not with bitterness, but with understanding. They were attached to the version of you that was constantly accommodating, constantly shrinking, constantly available for their emotional needs while neglecting your own. When you stop playing that role, they interpret it as betrayal. But here's what you now understand: their discomfort with your boundaries is information about them, not evidence that you're doing something wrong. The people who truly see you, who genuinely want your well-being, they celebrate your emergence. They've been waiting for the real you all along. You develop what I call ethical selfishness. This isn't the narcissistic self-absorption that disregards others. It's the radical act of including yourself in the circle of people you treat with compassion. When you make decisions, your own needs enter the equation, not as an afterthought, not with guilt, but as legitimate factors deserving consideration. You can help someone and rest when you're tired. You can love someone and maintain boundaries. You can be generous and keep something for yourself. These aren't contradictions. They're the mark of sustainable compassion. This brings us to what I call the paradox of the empty cup. There's a popular saying that suggests you cannot pour from an empty cup, that you must fill yourself first before you can give to others. And while this sounds wise on the surface, I've observed something more nuanced in the human psyche. The truth is more circular than linear. Yes, you need something in your cup to give. But here's what most people miss. The act of pouring, of genuine giving, can itself be replenishing. It's not that you fill up completely and then give. You give a little, and in that giving, if it's authentic, you receive something back. Not always from the person you gave to, but from the universe, from meaning itself, from the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to your values. I've seen people wait their entire lives to feel full enough to give. They hoard resources, time, energy, waiting for some magical moment when they'll feel abundant enough to share. That moment rarely comes, because abundance isn't a destination you arrive at, it's a state of mind you cultivate through action. But, and this is crucial, this doesn't mean giving from depletion. There's a difference between giving from a half-full cup and scraping the bottom of an empty one. The former is sustainable generosity. The latter is martyrdom, and martyrdom helps no one in the long run. I remember working with a teacher who came to me completely exhausted. She'd been giving everything to her students, staying late, taking work home, spending her own money on supplies. I love them, she said. How can I stop? But she wasn't asking for permission to stop loving. She was asking for permission to stop dying. We worked on what I call bounded generosity. She still gave, her time, her care, her expertise. But she set office hours. She used school supplies. She took her weekends back. And you know what happened? She became a better teacher. Because she was no longer giving from resentment and exhaustion. She was giving from choice and energy. Your generosity is most powerful when it comes from a place of strength, not weakness. From fullness, not emptiness. From joy, not obligation. When you give from depletion, you unconsciously attach strings to your generosity. You keep score. You harbor resentment. You create debts in relationships where none should exist. This is not truly giving. It is bargaining dressed in the costume of kindness. I have watched people exhaust themselves in service to others, believing this to be virtue, only to collapse into bitterness when their sacrifices go unacknowledged. They gave everything, yes, but they gave from an empty vessel. And an empty vessel, no matter how often it pours itself out, cannot nourish anyone for long. The paradox is this: to give generously to others, You must first be generous with yourself. You must fill your own cup. You must tend your own garden. You must ensure that the well from which you draw has water in it. This is not selfishness. This is wisdom. Think of the parent who denies themselves every comfort, every moment of rest, every small pleasure, in order to provide for their children. Noble, you might think. But watch what happens over time. The exhaustion seeps into their interactions. The resentment builds beneath the surface. The children learn that love means self-destruction, that care means suffering, that giving requires martyrdom. Contrast this with the parent who maintains their own vitality, who models balance, who demonstrates that generosity flows naturally from a life that is itself being lived well. These children learn something entirely different. They learn that love creates more life, not less. That generosity expands energy rather than depleting it. Your capacity to serve the world is directly proportional to your capacity to serve yourself. Not in indulgence, but in honest care. Not in narcissism, but in genuine replenishment. I am not suggesting you abandon responsibility or retreat into hedonism. I am suggesting that you recognize the simple truth that you cannot pour from an empty vessel. You cannot light another's way if your own flame has gone out. Rest is not earned, it is required. Joy is not optional, it is fuel. Pleasure is not guilty, it is medicine. When you give yourself permission to receive, to rest, to delight, to replenish, you create an abundance that naturally overflows toward others. Your generosity becomes effortless because it costs you nothing. It is the overflow of a life being lived with fullness. This is not selfishness, this is wisdom. The soul knows what it needs to thrive, and when you ignore its quiet requests, you do not become more noble. You become brittle. You become a servant to an ideal that no longer serves life itself. I have seen people sacrifice everything for what they believed was love, only to discover they had sacrificed love itself in the process. They gave until they were hollow, and then wondered why their relationships felt empty. They could not understand that their partner did not want a martyr. They wanted a companion, someone alive and present, not someone performing their own crucifixion daily. True intimacy requires two whole people, not one person splintered into service and another drowning in unspoken guilt. And here is what no one tells you about self-sacrifice. The people you sacrifice for can feel it. They sense the resentment simmering beneath your smile. They notice the exhaustion you try to hide. And it becomes a burden to them, to be the reason for your depletion, to carry the weight of your unwanted martyrdom. You think you are giving them a gift, but you are handing them a debt they never asked to owe. The most loving thing you can do is to take responsibility for your own fulfillment. To stop outsourcing your happiness to others and then resenting them when they fail to fill you. To recognize that your well-being is not their job, it is yours. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you care from a place of abundance rather than desperation. You offer what you have, not what you do not. You give from your overflow, not from your reserves. And when you cannot give, when you are tired, when you need space, when your soul is asking for quiet, you honor that. You trust that the relationship can hold your honesty. You trust that love does not require your constant performance. Because real love is not impressed by suffering. Real love wants you whole. I think of the garden again, how nothing in nature apologizes for taking what it needs. The tree does not feel guilty for drawing nutrients from the soil. The flower does not question whether it deserves the sun. They take what sustains them, and in doing so, they become what they are meant to be. You are no different. You are part of this same living system, and you are allowed to nourish yourself without justification. This permission you seek from others, you will never receive it. Not because the world is cruel, but because permission is not theirs to give. They are struggling with their own shadows, their own unanswered needs. How can someone drowning give you permission to breathe? You must take the radical step of granting yourself what you have been waiting for. Not through arrogance or entitlement, but through the simple recognition that your existence has worth. You do not need to earn your air. You do not need to justify your water. And you do not need to apologize for wanting more than survival. I have spent decades listening to people confess their desires as if they were crimes. A woman tells me she wants to paint, but immediately adds that she knows it is foolish, that she has responsibilities, that others need her time more. A man admits he dreams of leaving his profession, then laughs nervously and calls himself ungrateful. They speak of their longings in whispers, as if the walls might judge them. What strikes me most is not the desire itself, but the guilt that wraps around it like chains. They have internalized the voice that says wanting is wrong. That pleasure must be earned through sufficient suffering. That rest is laziness unless you are on the verge of collapse. This is the voice of the tyrant, the internalized parent, society, or God who demands endless sacrifice. It is the voice that Carl Jung spoke of when he described conditions of worth. You are acceptable only if. You are lovable only when. You may rest only after. But the self does not flourish under tyranny. It withers. It becomes small and bitter and resentful. The energy that could flow toward growth and creation turns inward, becoming anxiety and depression. You become a pressure cooker with no release valve, and eventually, something must give. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with creativity specifically? Everything. Because creativity isn't a luxury. It isn't decoration for life. It's the fundamental impulse toward wholeness. When I painted my mandalas, when I carved stone, when I built my tower at Bollingen, these weren't hobbies. They were necessities. They were how I stayed sane through my most difficult years. The creative act is how the unconscious speaks to consciousness. It's the bridge between who you are and who you're becoming. When you deny yourself this bridge, you're not just losing the pleasure of making something. You're cutting yourself off from your own depths. You're refusing to listen to the most essential parts of yourself. I've watched this happen countless times. A person comes to me drowning in neurotic symptoms, insomnia, compulsions, unexplained anxieties. And when we dig deeper, we find a creative impulse that's been dammed up for years. A writer who stopped writing to take the sensible job. A painter who put away the brushes when the children came. A musician who decided that adulthood meant silence. And here's what's tragic. They often don't connect their suffering to this loss. They think their depression is about their marriage, or their career dissatisfaction, or some chemical imbalance. They don't recognize that their psyche is starving for expression. The unconscious doesn't give up. It keeps knocking. And when you refuse to open the door willingly, it breaks windows. This is why creative blocks are never just technical problems. You don't overcome writer's block by learning better writing techniques. You overcome it by asking why the unconscious has withdrawn its cooperation. What are you afraid to say? What are you refusing to see? What part of yourself are you still trying to keep hidden? The block is the message. The resistance is information. Your psyche is telling you, not this way. Not this false thing you're trying to create to please others or protect yourself. I want the real thing. I want the truth. And yes, facing that truth is terrifying. Because when you start looking at your shadow, when you start pulling away the masks, you realize how much of your life has been a performance. How many of your relationships are built on pretense? How many of your achievements are motivated by fear rather than genuine desire? You realize that the person you've been showing the world isn't really you at all. It's a carefully constructed defense mechanism. A survival strategy you developed years ago to avoid rejection, to gain approval, to stay safe in a world that felt dangerous. And here's what makes this so painful. That strategy worked. It kept you alive. It got you through difficult times. It earned you love, or at least what looked like love. It brought you success, or at least what looked like success. So letting it go feels like dying. It feels like you're destroying the very thing that saved you. But here's what I learned, what I saw again and again in my work with people. That defense mechanism that once saved you is now imprisoning you. The mask that protected you as a child is suffocating you as an adult. The performance that earned you approval is exhausting you. It's keeping you from experiencing real intimacy, real joy, real meaning. Because you can't experience genuine connection while wearing a mask. You can't know yourself while constantly performing. You can't find your purpose while living someone else's script. The path to becoming who you really are requires letting go of who you've been pretending to be. And that process, that transformation, is what I call individuation. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about stripping away everything that isn't authentically you. It's archaeology, not construction. You're not building a self. You're excavating one. You're digging through layers of conditioning, expectation, trauma, and defense to find the person who was always there underneath. And I won't lie to you, this process is brutal. There will be moments when you question everything. Moments when you feel like you're losing your mind. Moments when the old you fights desperately to survive, throwing up every defense, every rationalization, every distraction. Your ego will tell you this is dangerous. That you're being selfish. That you're destroying your life. But let me tell you what actually happens when you dare to become who you truly are. The people who were draining you, they fade away. Not through confrontation, not through drama, They simply lose interest when you stop being their emotional feeding ground. The narcissist finds a new supply. The victim finds a new rescuer. The critic finds someone else to diminish. And yes, there will be a period of loneliness. A desert crossing. This is the part no one warns you about. The space between leaving who you were and becoming who you are. Your old friends don't recognize you anymore. Your family still expects the version of you they're comfortable with. You haven't yet found your tribe. But this loneliness is sacred. It's necessary. It's in this wilderness that you discover what you actually think, feel, want. Not what you've been conditioned to think. Not what keeps the peace. Not what earns approval. What you actually believe when no one is watching. I spent years in this space. Withdrew from my colleagues at the university. From the psychoanalytic societies that wanted me to stay in line with Freud's theories. People thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. The mind they'd constructed for me, certainly. But in that solitude, I found the work that mattered. The concepts that would outlive me. The understanding that psychology wasn't just about pathology, it was about becoming whole. Here's what integration actually looks like. You become less predictable. Your people-pleasing friends will hate this. You become more honest. Your conflict-avoidant family will call you difficult. You develop boundaries. Those who benefited from your boundarylessness will call you cold. You pursue what matters to you. Those invested in your smallness will call you selfish. Let them, because on the other side of their discomfort is your authenticity. And authenticity is magnetic in a way performance never was. You'll attract different people. People who aren't intimidated by your growth, who celebrate your boundaries, who are doing their own integration work. These relationships feel different. There's no manipulation, no hidden agendas, no walking on eggshells. Just two whole people encountering each other honestly. It's almost shocking how simple human connection becomes when you're not managing everyone's emotions. When I stopped trying to earn love, I discovered something I never expected. I became genuinely interested in other people. Not in what they could give me, not in whether they approved of me, but in who they actually were. This might sound strange, but the need for validation is incredibly narcissistic. When you're desperate for approval, you're not really seeing the other person at all. You're watching yourself in their eyes, monitoring their reactions, calculating whether you're measuring up. Every conversation becomes a performance review where you're simultaneously the anxious employee and the harsh judge. But when that hunger dissolves, suddenly there's space to notice things. You hear what people are actually saying instead of scanning for praise or criticism. You see their struggles, their contradictions, their hidden brilliance. You become curious about their inner world instead of obsessed with their opinion of yours. I remember a conversation with my father after this shift happened. For years, our interactions had been tense. Me trying to prove I wasn't a disappointment, him never quite giving me the approval I craved. Then one day, I realized I wasn't performing anymore. I asked him about his own childhood, something I'd never thought to do. And he opened up in ways I'd never witnessed. The relationship didn't magically become perfect. But it became real. I stopped needing him to be a certain way, and paradoxically, that created space for genuine connection. This applies to everyone you meet. When you're not silently begging for validation, people sense it. They relax around you. They stop performing too. Conversations stop being transactional. You're not trading compliments and reassurances like currency. Instead, there's actual exchange, real curiosity, moments of unexpected depth. You also stop collecting people like trophies. The validation seeker surrounds themselves with admirers, people who reflect back the image they want to see. But these relationships are exhausting to maintain because they're built on performance, not presence. When you're whole, your relationships naturally become more selective. Not in an elitist way, but in an honest one. You're drawn to people who are also interested in truth, in depth, in showing up as they are. You stop performing for approval. You stop trying to convince people you're worthy of their time. You simply exist in your truth, and those who resonate with that truth will find you. The others will drift away, and you'll feel no need to chase them. This is what I call right relationship, where two people meet each other in reality, not in fantasy. Where you don't need the other person to complete you, but you choose them because they enrich what's already whole within you. That kind of connection doesn't deplete you. It doesn't leave you anxious or second-guessing. It nourishes you because it's rooted in mutual recognition, not mutual need. And here's something I want you to understand deeply. Wholeness doesn't mean you become an island. It doesn't mean you stop needing people or caring about connection. It means you stop clinging to people to avoid feeling your own emptiness. You engage with others from a place of fullness, not lack. And paradoxically, that's when your relationships become most meaningful, most alive. You see, when you're no longer using people to escape yourself, you can actually see them. You can hear what they're saying without filtering it through your own fears. You can love them without needing them to be different. You can disagree without it threatening your sense of self. This is the fruit of individuation, not isolation, but genuine intimacy. Now, let me speak to the question that might be arising in you. Jung, is this process ever finished? Do I reach a point where I'm done, where I've arrived? And my answer is this: individuation is not a destination. It's a direction. You don't complete it and then coast for the rest of your life. You continue deepening, refining, discovering new layers. The psyche is inexhaustible. Every time you integrate one shadow element, another emerges. Every time you think you've understood yourself, life presents a new challenge that reveals something you hadn't seen. But here's what changes. You stop resisting the process. You stop wishing it would end. You begin to see that this ongoing unfolding is the point. That becoming who you are is not a problem to solve, but a mystery to live. And perhaps most surprisingly, you begin to laugh at yourself, not with cruelty, but with a kind of tender recognition. You see how seriously you took your fears, how dramatically you clung to your suffering, how convinced you were that your particular darkness was unique in all the world. But it wasn't. It was utterly, beautifully human. The demons you faced were the same ones humanity has always faced: the fear of insignificance, the terror of abandonment, the crushing weight of mortality. Your personal hell was built from the same materials as everyone else's, just arranged in your own particular pattern. And there's something oddly comforting in that. You're not special in your suffering. You're not uniquely broken. You're simply human, walking the same path that millions have walked before, that millions will walk after. The difference now is that you walk it consciously. You know the terrain. You recognize the landmarks. When the shadow appears again, and it will, you don't panic. You've met before. You know this dance. This doesn't mean you've conquered it. The shadow cannot be conquered. It can only be integrated, acknowledged, given its proper place at the table of your psyche. You learn to say, "Ah, there you are again. Yes, I see you. What are you trying to show me this time?" Because every return of the shadow brings a new lesson, a deeper layer, another piece of yourself you hadn't fully claimed. The work is never complete because you are never complete. You are always becoming. And in this endless becoming, you find something your younger self would never have believed: peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of acceptance. Not the peace of arrival, but the peace of being genuinely present for the journey. You stop dividing your life into before and after, broken and healed, lost and found. You see it all as one continuous movement, one long conversation with yourself, one gradual awakening to who you've always been beneath the layers of fear and pretense. You realize that you were never really lost. You were just looking away.